Hello, in this short video lesson I'm going to try to explain the basic concepts underlying the person-centered approach in counselling and psychotherapy. This approach was formulated by Carl Rogers in California in the 1950s. Rogers had been a psychiatrist before becoming a psychotherapist, but I'm not going to go into his biography because there's an enormous amount of material about him on the internet. So if you just Google Carl Rogers with a C and without the D in Rogers. So the theory, as with every theory, including any integrative theory, the person-centered model has a preface. That's a way of understanding how human personality develops. And I'd just like to say, with a smile on my face at this point, that if you're a counselling student, and particularly if you're one of mine, you'll need to be able to talk in the theoretical language of the model and also be able to articulate it in everyday layman's language. Now, person-centered theory states that we all come into the world with an innate drive to self-actualize. That means we're driven to reach our fullest potential if we have the right conditions. So a small baby will assert its needs easily. He or she will cry to let us know they're hungry or frightened, or if they just need to be held, or if they need to be cleaned. And if you've ever had a young child, you'll know that they don't need to think very much about this or consider it very much. They have good self-esteem. And with love and good enough nurturing, together with the freedom to safely explore and experience, then they will be driven to be the very best that they can be. And that's subjective and very individual. This is what Rogers referred to as the organismic self. It's, if you like, the authentic self that has not yet become contaminated by the conditions placed upon it by other people. However, things are about to change for the baby. As we learn that we're separate and individual, and that probably happens at about 4 to 6 months old, we develop a self-concept. And this is formed along with our need for positive regard, which means being loved and accepted and wanted. But we soon learn that if we behave in certain ways, then we're less likely to feel accepted, and so we begin to fit in with others' needs. We realize that the love and acceptance we receive is conditional, and this is referred to as the conditions of worth. Our actualizing tendency leads us to want to experiment with certain behaviors, and some of them are not acceptable, so we end up feeling bad, not acceptable to others. So as adults, our actualizing drive may say, I want to do this, or this is what I feel, whilst our self-concept says, I'm not the sort of person who does that, or I'm not a person who has these feelings, and I must never experience them. This conflict is expressed from time to time in everyday remarks that you'd hear, such as, I feel I'm not being true to myself, or I don't want anybody to know the real me. And it can be these feelings that lead a great many people to seek counselling, whether or not they're aware of it. Something else may be the catalyst or presenting issue. So for Rogers, the aim of counselling is to help people in their growth process. The focus is on the here and now experience, and while the past may come into the work if the client goes there, it wouldn't be a focus of the work in the same way that it would be in a purely psychodynamic model. The focus is also on the person and not on the problem. He felt it was essential that the client-counsellor relationship was one of equality, and that the counsellor should not direct the client in any way. Now that means tell the client how to lead their lives rather than helping them focus. This is clearly a really difficult thing to achieve, and Rogers himself admitted that he often fell short of this ideal. However, he felt that the counsellor should always strive towards it. Any counsellor working with this model needs to bring attitudes or conditions to the relationship. And Carl Rogers proposed 6 conditions, but 3 of them are what we know as the core conditions. And the first of these is congruence. Congruence means that the counsellor strives to be him or herself rather than hiding behind any role. They'll always be in touch with their own feelings in as far as that's possible. And this is the really important part. And they must be willing to risk communicating these feelings to the client when that's appropriate and when it's in the best interest of the client. And of course, this also needs to be done when the timing is right and when the client is able to tolerate immediacy. Being congruent means that the gap between the self-concept and the organismic self is as narrow as it can be. And that's one reason why there's so much self-development work involved in counselling training. The idea here is that when the counsellor conducts a congruent, real relationship with the client, then the client will be more increasingly free to express a range of feelings about themselves. They'll get a more accurate perception of themselves and of other people and their relationships with other people. And they'll hopefully notice the incongruence between their own self-concept and their actual experience. That insight will help them to make different choices and narrow the gap between their self-concept and their organismic self. From a person-centered point of view, the client is seen as incongruent, otherwise they wouldn't be in therapy. And one of the goals of the work is to help them to become more congruent. The second of the three important core conditions is unconditional positive regard. The counsellor provides an ongoing, positive, non-possessive warmth and acceptance of the client. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to approve of all aspects of your client's behaviour. It's really simply about accepting them as they are and having no agenda other than your client's growth. Unconditional positive regard is a means of giving the client a more congruent experience of a relationship. In other words, it should counteract the conditions of worth that I talked about a little bit earlier. And the last, but by no means least of the core conditions, is accurate empathy. Rogers described empathy as a sensitive, non-intrusive, temporary and confident living within another person's life. We sometimes talk about walking in another person's shoes as if you were the other person. Now, Rogers himself would point out that the as if is as important as the rest of that phrase, because truly we can't fully enter into another's experience, and if we could, then we'd stop being helpful, because we'd no longer be objective. When accurate empathic understanding is successfully communicated to the client, they usually are likely to become increasingly free to express their feelings and to explore themselves, their relationships, their situations, and especially those parts of themselves that might have previously been denied. They'll become more congruent, less defensive, and much more open to new experiences. The person-centered approach also looks at a theoretical concept known as the Locus of Evaluation. Just another way of looking at how we see ourselves, really. And this is about how we measure ourselves, our self-worth and our self-esteem. And the Locus of Evaluation can be mainly external or mainly internal. If it's external, then we'll depend disproportionately on how others perceive us. But if it's internal, we're more likely to be more emotionally and psychologically robust. We can take feedback, but we'll be secure enough in ourselves that we can tolerate criticism or the fact that other people might not like us, or everybody won't like us, that's for sure. Now, we might not like that, but it won't crush us. So they're the main concepts associated with the person-centered model in counselling and psychotherapy. I hope that short video lesson was useful and that I'll see you soon again.